It was the end of another busy day on the island of Sodor. Percy the small engine had just delivered some trucks of coal and was looking forward to a rest in the sheds. He was surprised to see that Gordon, Henry, and James were already there. James was sitting on the turntable, blocking Percy out. "And just what do you think you're doing?" asked James. "Don't be silly, James," said Percy. "I've had a busy day and want to rest. Now let me in." "These sheds are reserved," said James, "for members of the Secret Tender Club." "Secret Tender Club?" asked Percy. "What's that?" "That's no concern for a little engine like you," said Gordon. "And besides," said Henry, "this club is for tender engines only." "That's right," said James. "No tank engines allowed." "Rubbish," fumed Percy, and went away in a huff. He soon found Thomas and told him all about the Secret Tender Club. "Those silly engines said the same thing to me," grunted Thomas. "Too puffed up in the smoke box, I think." "We'll have to pay them out," said Percy, but neither knew how. Edward pulled up. "You two look glum," he pondered. "Whatever's the matter?" Thomas and Percy told Edward about the club. Edward frowned. "Tell you what, I'll investigate for you. I have a feeling they'll talk to me, considering I have a tender." "Thank you, Edward," the tank engine said. Edward made his way to the sheds. He saw the big engines laughing and joking with themselves. "What's all this in aid of?" asked Edward. "Ah, Edward," said James. "Just the engine I wanted to see. I would like to invite you to join our club." "What club?" "The Secret Tender Club, of course," finished James. "We're always on the lookout for new members," said Gordon. "We've just invited Emily to join." Edward looked unimpressed. "Members get to have special benefits," said Henry. "That's right," said James. "Our drivers will let us taste human food. Sounds interesting, doesn't it?" "Well, I think it's silly," said Edward dryly. "Engines don't need food. We can't even eat it like people. It'll just burn up in your fireboxes." "I guess you'll miss out on the fun," James scoffed. Edward groaned and puffed away. The next morning, the drivers and firemen arrived early with eggs, bread, sausage, beans, and bacon. They lit their fires and cooked the food on shovels in their fireboxes, then settled down to have a fireman's breakfast. After they've eaten their fill, they cooked up another batch of breakfast for the engines to try. "Are you ready?" asked the drivers. "Yes," said the engines excitedly. So the firemen dumped the food into their fireboxes. The engines waited. Said James. "I can't really taste anything." "It's no different than the fires we're used to," said Emily. Henry sniffed. "Although my fire does smell a bit different," he pondered. "Indeed," said Gordon. "A nice change from the coal smell we're used to." "Quite enjoyable," finished James. "I'm actually quite fond of a fireman's breakfast," said James's driver. "We shall do it again tomorrow." "Hooray!" the engines cheered. For the rest of the day, Emily, Gordon, Henry, and James told all the other tender engines they could about the breakfast they've had. Thomas and Percy were still crossed at being removed from the sheds. Toby tried to cheer them up. "I remember back on my old line," said Toby. "My driver used to make his breakfast in my firebox from time to time." "But I bet he didn't make a silly club out of it," sighed Percy. "What if we made our own club?" said Thomas. "And we won't let them in." "No, Thomas," said Toby. "If you did that, you'd be no better than they are." I suppose you're right, said Thomas. I'm sure they'll get bored with it, eventually. The next morning, the Secret Tender Club had their breakfast meeting again. They were enjoying themselves immensely. Who has tenders on our backs? Who keeps all the trains on track?
We do!
We do!
Who keeps all our crews well fed? Who now occupies these sheds?
We do! We do!
Who heats the fire for the Sunday roast? Who cooks the sausages and toast?
We do!
We do!
Who's the best without a doubt? Who keeps small tank engines out?
We do! We do!
Later that day, Percy was delivering the mail. He had stopped at Knapford when the Fat Controller spoke to him. You do look glum, Percy, he said. Yes, sir. I am, sir. Why? It's the big engines, sir, said Percy. They've made a club and have breakfast every morning, and they won't let me or Thomas in the sheds. Yes, Percy, Edward told me all about the Secret Tender Club, said the Fat Controller. And while they have not caused confusion or delay to any work on my railway, it is unfair to you and Thomas. But what shall we do, sir? Asked Percy. Don't worry, said the Fat Controller. I know just what to do. That evening, the big engines were ready for a good night's rest when Thomas and Percy came up to the turntable. Excuse me, sniffed James, but you tankies are trespassing on Secret Tender Club property. I think you'll find, said a familiar voice, that these sheds are part of my railway and therefore belong to me. Henry, Gordon, James and Emily gasped. And, continued the Fat Controller, because this is railway property, I can decide who can and cannot stay in these sheds. But, sir, James stammered. Therefore, the Fat Controller concluded, I declare that any of my engines are allowed to stay here, regardless if they have a tender or not. Yes, sir, said James, feeling defeated. Sorry, sir. Thomas and Percy were happy to have their sheds back. One more thing, James, said the Fat Controller. Your breakfast scheme has given me an idea. And what an idea it was. The Fat Controller had arranged for all his engines to help cook firemen's breakfasts for their crews, workers, and their families. Everyone enjoyed themselves, even James. Well, James, said Edward, I guess it goes to show that it's best to share the fun you have with everyone rather than keep it to yourself. I suppose you're right, said James, even if you don't have a tender.